Hello and welcome back. It's your nerdy suburban farmer. I'm in the wormery today, so it is another worm update. Starting off with the regular totes. I do have to say, since the weather has taken a turn for the cooler here in New Jersey, the regular totes have dried out. So they are not as wet as they have been the past couple of weeks. They're not to the consistency I like, but they are definitely not as wet as they used to be. The material here is looking good, and the worm colony is thriving, and there isn't much food left in this first bin, so the worms went through everything that I put in from the previous week. So this bin is looking pretty good and turning around from how it looked a couple weeks ago. And I had the same result for the second regular tote. This one also dried out. This one along the edges was a little bit more dried out than its sister bin. But the material has definitely dried out a lot. It's not as damp. There aren't really many clumps at the bottom. There are still some. And again, it's still a little bit wetter than what I would prefer. But as I sifted through it and fluffed it up, there wasn't a lot of food left over, and their colony of worms were happy. Here are some of the worms in the bin. They look really good. They're plump. The material is not too wet. So I'm overall happy with how this bin is turning around. So after sifting through both bins, I am giving them, still working with the melons. So I still have a lot of leftover melons from this summer. So I'm giving them wetter feedings, which can be contributing to the bins being a little damp. But no cardboard is being added at this time. Just adding the melons, the grit, and then covering both the bins up. Since both of my totes are still damp, I'm not spreading out the bubble wrap. I'm just laying it on top. I'm not taking it out completely because I've got worms still hanging out on the bubble wrap. So I put the bubble wrap in, put the mosquito netting to help it stay or get a little drier, and putting the cheesecloth on the other one. And these bins are done for the week. So it's week 1 of baiting the worms out of the harvest trays. If you remember, this just had food and a little bit of the castings put on top. So I'm going to take this and dump it into the home Vermibag tote for these worms. And after a week, this is all the worms that migrated into the bait tray. And this is why I prefer to use the bait tray versus the migration, because all of the worms stay in the tray. They don't try to migrate back out to look for food because all of the goodies are in the tray. So I ended up getting a lot of worms out of this particular harvest bait tray. And once I finish cleaning the bait tray out, then I just replace it back. I don't do anything special with it since I'm still collecting the worms, but I just repeat the same process over. Put a bunch of food into the bait tray, put in the grit, and then cover it back up. Once the food is all covered, this tray is done and packed up, and I move on to my next harvest bait tray. With this harvest tray, the castings were a bit wetter than its sister tray. So I'm going to rotate the trays as I save them and leave this one on top to allow the air to get through this one to dry it out a little bit. But again, the process is the same. I remove the castings from the top. You may lose some worms by using just the castings at the top, but they'll still come back the next time around. And as well with this bait tray, I do have a lot of worms that ended up going into. So again, for me, this is the reason why I do the baiting versus the horizontal migration, because I just seem to have so much success in doing it this way, and I get so many worms quicker than how a migration, which can normally take 4 to 6 weeks. And then breaking up the clump from within the bait tray, you can see all the worms that I got for this one. A great portion of the worms, considering I started with about 250 to 500 worms in the bin. I've got a good portion of them here. So once the tray is emptied, I just mix up the material, and I don't feed my new or restarted Vermibag totes or any restarted bins that I do because of the cardboard and the material that's in there already. I won't feed it for the first week that I have it after being baited out. I just put some grit on the top of it and then close it up. Once finished with the home or restarted Vermibag totes, for the second tray, I'm just doing the exact same as I did for the first by adding a good source of food and treats that the worms love, putting some grit, and then covering it with castings and setting it aside for another week to bait out additional worms. And lastly, it is the Vermibag Mini. Now, the Mini didn't have any additional leachate at the bottom for the past couple of weeks, so I believe the moisture issue inside of this one is under control. But as far as how the castings felt, the castings were a bit wet still. The worms are successfully staying at the top, so I'm not too concerned about the dampness of the castings right now. It may be an issue later when it comes time to harvest, but right now, a lot of the worms are sticking to the top, so I'm going to just move forward, but with a couple of tweaks. Instead of putting just a layer of cardboard after the food, I'm going to put some cardboard at the bottom, then layer in the food. And I'm going to give it a larger feeding because I do still want to keep the worms at the top and not have them search for food lower. And then I'm going to add the grit and then add a layer of cardboard on top as well. The purpose in trying to do this is to keep the moisture from seeping lower into the castings that are older and keeping it towards the top, which is going to provide an environment that the worms enjoy. After adding the top layer of cardboard, I'm just putting down the bubble wrap, and this is done. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.